It all began in the evergreen, often rainy, but occasionally sunny Ireland of County Cork, the very county from which the ill-fated Titanic set sail on its final voyage. However, this has nothing to do with our almost detective story. County Cork, July. The scent of fresh baking filled the O'Connor household. Mary pulled a rhubarb pie from the oven, her mother's cherished family recipe. Banner, repeatedly missing the nail with his hammer. "Dad, you keep missing," 9-year-old Nell chirped, hopping on one foot. "Let me do it." "Stay out of it, Nell," scolded the eldest, 12-year-old Fiona, as she arranged the plates. "Help me set the table instead." Evan stood in the middle of the kitchen. 18 years old, tall, wearing glasses, with a folder tucked under his arm. Inside the folder was an honors certificate and an acceptance letter from the University of Dublin. The Faculty of Architecture. "I still can't believe it," Evan said, turning the letter over in his hands. "Mom, Dad, it's Dublin." Mary threw her arms around him, leaving a smudge of flour on his cheek. "That means you'll be coming home on weekends, and you'll design a new house for us." "A new house?" Arthur finally drove the nail home. "Mary, what are you talking about?" Mary gave him that look, the one that always made Arthur's heart skip a beat. "Arthur, our son is going to Dublin. Are we going to commute 4 hours each way just to see him?" "No, we're moving closer." A hush fell over the kitchen. Then Fiona spoke up. "Does that mean we're going to live in Dublin? Awesome!" Nell squealed with delight. Evan hugged his mother. And Arthur realized the decision had been made. August, selling the house. The house in Bantry sat on a hill overlooking the bay. The O'Connors had lived there for 14 years. Its walls held the memories of Nell's first steps, Fiona's doodles on the wallpaper, and Evan's blueprints scattered across the floor. "It's hard to sell," Arthur admitted that evening after the kids were in bed. "It's harder not seeing Evan," Mary replied. "He'll be in the dorms, but we'll be nearby." "That's what matters." They put the house on the market, and they got lucky. The buyers, a young couple from England, fell in love with the garden and the bay view at first sight. "We need to move fast," they said. "We'll pay above asking if you can be out by the end of August." "It's a deal," Arthur said, shaking hands. "We can do that." The funds hit their account in the blink of an eye. It was a handsome sum, almost enough for a mortgage down payment near Dublin. Almost. September. Dublin. The rented flat. The third-floor flat in Rathmines was cramped, with low ceilings and creaky floorboards. But the kitchen window overlooked a park, and every morning Mary would brew coffee and watch Evan head off to his first lecture, lugging a massive drafting tube. "Smells like a fresh start," she said, setting her mug on the table. "Smells like a rental," Arthur muttered, checking his banking app. "Mary, we're short on the deposit." "By about 30,000, Mary said nothing. She ran the numbers in her head. A teacher's salary, an accountant's wage, Evan's stipend. It just didn't add up. "Mom," Fiona peeked into the kitchen. "Are we moving into our own house soon?" Nell is sick of sleeping on the pull-out sofa. Mary pulled her daughter close. "Soon, sweetheart. We'll find something." That evening, as Mary scrolled through her phone, a message popped up from her old friend Sierra down in Cork. "Mary, heard you're in Dublin. There's this thing called rent to buy. Basically, you move in now, pay rent, and a portion goes towards the house price. My neighbor just got a townhouse that way. Have a look, might be right up your alley." Mary reread the text 3 times. "Arthur," she called out. Arthur walked in with a mug of tea. He read it and raised an eyebrow. "Sounds intriguing. Sounds like an opportunity," Mary said, already opening her browser. "We start looking tomorrow." She tossed and turned all night, dreaming of Evan having his friends over to their very own house, of Nell hanging her drawings on the wall, of Fiona finally getting a dog. For the next 3 weeks, the O'Connors lived like treasure hunters in a movie. After work, After school, on weekends they went to countless viewings, but not a single place inspired them to settle down. And then Mary stumbled upon the Haven Homes Agency website. "Arthur, look at this," she said, turning her laptop toward him. "Your dream home is available today. Rent-to-buy scheme. Your rent payments count toward your initial down payment, and the price is locked in. Wide selection of properties." "We have to go," he said. And that was how they ended up at Haven Homes. Three years earlier, the Blackwood residence, 15 minutes from Dublin. The house was still grand, but the paint on the shutters was peeling, and cheap briquettes sparked in the fireplace instead of solid oak. Maintaining the estate had become like feeding a racehorse on a single salary. Eleanor barged in without knocking. Gray suit, white heels, clutching the keys to an Audi that had just been hauled away by a tow truck. "Dad, it's dead," Eleanor said, tossing the keys onto the mahogany desk. "Done for." Silas Blackwood, aged 67, looked up from his laptop. He still carried himself like a barrister, but his suit hung off him like a sack. 3 years ago, he wore it to high court hearings. Now, the only trials were in his head. "Buy a new one," he said flatly. "With what?" Eleanor sat across from him. "Your promising project swallowed everything. The Green Chain ICO, remember? You said, L, this is the future. We'll be collecting dividends and sipping champagne in Bali. Instead, we can't even afford the upkeep of this house. And looking at our bank balance is terrifying." Silas took off his glasses and wiped them. "I invested 400 grand. We're not destitute. We have the house. We have your education. And we have our brains." "Brains don't keep a roof over our heads," Eleanor said, leaning back. "I trained as a property appraiser, Dad. I know the market inside out. And you know the law. Together, we could." "What?" Silas narrowed his eyes. "Make money off people who are desperate for a home but can't scrape together a deposit. The post-COVID world is full of them. Banks are squeezing them dry, prices are skyrocketing, but the dream is still there." Silas remained silent. Outside, the rain whispered through the willows. The very willows that gave the estate its name. A week later, they were back in Silas's study. On the desk sat a bottle of whiskey, unopened since last Christmas, and a printed copy of the rent-to-buy legislation. Rent-to-buy. Silas tapped the paragraph with his finger. "A perfectly legal scheme, if you play by the rules. But rules are just lines, and there's plenty of breathing room between the lines." Eleanor pulled out her tablet. "Watch this. Step 1. We find a house. Ours. The Old Willows. It's old. It needs work. But it looks like a postcard. We list it 30% below market value. To get them on the hook. Step 2, Silas said, pouring more whiskey. We charge an option fee, 20 grand. We put non-refundable in the fine print. The client signs it. To them, it feels like pocket change compared to the price of a house. Step 3. Eleanor flashed a bright, predatory smile. We hike the rent 40% above market rates. We tell them. A portion goes toward the purchase price. But we don't process it as a property payment. We frame it as consulting fees for Haven Homes, my agency. Silas nodded, the barrister in him calculating the odds. And what if the bank approves their mortgage? They won't. Eleanor took a sip of whiskey. Because step 4, the house already has a judgment mortgage on it. Your old Green Chain debts. We legally cannot sell it. But the contract doesn't say that. And when the bank inevitably rejects them a year down the line, we terminate the agreement. Citing tenant default. And we pocket the 20 grand, plus all the rent. Silas stared at his daughter for a long time. Then, he raised his glass. To the breathing room between the lines, Elle. The first guinea pigs weren't the O'Connors. It was a couple from Cork. Young, naive, with a baby in tow, Eleanor pitched it to them at the Haven Homes office. It smelled of fresh coffee and new paint. Silas sat in the next room, listening in. We completely understand your situation. Eleanor purred, using her most trustworthy voice. You're short on the deposit, but we have an elegant solution. 2 years later, the couple walked away with nothing. The bank denied the loan. The house was subject to a judgment mortgage. The option fee of $15,000 remained with Eleanor. Along with every rent payment, Silas used the funds from the Haven Homes account to patch the roof at the Old Willows. It works, he declared. It works, Eleanor agreed, buttoning her gray blazer. Now, we find the next ones. They ironed out Silas's cover story. He couldn't be a barrister that was too suspicious. You'll play the elderly owner? Eleanor instructed. With a walking stick, a weary smile. My doctors are insisting I move to Portugal. People trust frail old men. And Agnes? Silas glanced at his wife, who was quietly knitting in the corner. Mother will stay silent. Eleanor shrugged. Her cold stare is just part of the scenery. She'll play the statue. Statues don't raise suspicions. Agnes looked up and offered a crooked smirk. The next day, the Old Willows went live on the Haven Homes website. The asking price flashed like a lure. The photos of the garden looked like a dream come true. The trap awaited its prey. Dublin smelled of an approaching storm, wet asphalt, and burnt coffee from a cheap vending machine in the Haven Homes agency office. Arthur O'Connor held the glass door for his wife with a smile. His hands were occupied with a thick folder of bank statements. At 45, he looked like a vigorous and confident man. Mary walked in and looked around, examining the surroundings. Her hair was elegantly styled, emphasizing her pleasant facial features. Her eyes expressed lively interest and joyful anticipation. They were taking the first step towards their new home. Mr. and Mrs. O'Connor, welcome. The voice sounded too sweet for a damp Dublin Monday. They were greeted by Eleanor Vance, the agency owner. Her ash-gray suit fit with elegant flawlessness. Her face was instantly endearing, but her smile. The smile was unnaturally white, symmetrical, and empty. That is how perfect families smile on bank brochures. Veneers. Damn expensive, Mary noted dryly to herself. I perfectly understand your situation. Eleanor gracefully seated them at a mahogany table and slid a glass of water toward Arthur. Your deposit is insufficient for a purchase. Banks are ruthless right now, but I have a solution. An elegant solution. She spread glossy brochures in front of them. At the very top, in large print, it read, Rent to Buy. You move in this month. You pay slightly more than standard rent, but this difference goes towards the house's value. In 2 years, when you have accumulated an internal deposit, the bank will easily grant you a mortgage for the balance, and the house is yours. No giant initial down payments. Arthur exhaled loudly, as if dropping a bag of cement. Mary just squinted. She could not stand the word elegant in financial matters. Finances should be boring. Property viewings stretched over 3 exhausting weeks. The first option, a dilapidated cottage on the northern outskirts, smelled of chronic dampness and hopelessness. In the bedroom, Mary picked at the edge of peeling wallpaper with her fingernail-thick black mold bloomed underneath. The spouses exchanged glances and walked out in silence. The second was a trendy townhouse in the center. beautiful, with panoramic windows. But as soon as a window was opened, the roar of Temple Bar burst in, clinking beer glasses, bass from the pubs, and shouting tourists. "I am too old to fall asleep to a bass guitar solo," Mary cut in. They viewed a dozen options. Either cracks in the foundation or the River Liffey's flood risk zone, where the ground floor could turn into a muddy pond with a floating sofa any given November. And then, finally, they arrived at the Old Willows estate. The name was a relic of the Victorian era, but the house itself, an old mansion 15 miles from the city, cozily entwined in evergreen ivy. Inside, there was the fresh smell of paint, gleaming oak parquet, and a heavy crystal chandelier in the spacious living room. And the price. The price was 20% below market value. The meeting with the hosts took place there, in the softly lit living room of the Willows. Silas Blackwood turned out to be an imposing gentleman with a neat gray beard. He leaned heavily on a cane with a tarnished silver pommel. Nearby, like a shadow, sat his wife Agnes, pale as parchment, hunched over, in a strict black dress. She did not utter a single word the entire evening, only watching the guests with an unblinking bird-like gaze. Arthur took off his glasses, frantically wiped them with a handkerchief, and put them back on, thinking he was seeing double from the numbers. Why so cheap? Mary's voice sounded reserved, but inside her splashed a knot of emotions: fear, hope, desire, apprehension. Eleanor sighed sympathetically, gracefully spreading her hands. "The owners are elderly people, an urgent relocation due to health reasons. They have absolutely no time for bargaining. They just want to leave the house in good hands. You are incredibly lucky." "The Irish dampness is killing me," Silas patted his sore knee and smiled warmly at Arthur. "The doctors are sending us down to the Algarve, sun, ocean, Portugal. We adore this house, Mr. O'Connor, but you cannot buy health for any money." Arthur nodded sincerely. He was used to trusting elderly people with canes and tired, kind eyes. Mary and Arthur returned home. "Kids," she shouted deep into the apartment, "this weekend we are going to see your future home." Joyful squeals from Nell and grumbling from Evan came from the room. "Mom, I have a model to submit." But Mary was already imagining how they would drink tea in that living room with the crystal chandelier, how Arthur would fix the creaky parquet, how they would all live together, big, their own, close to Dublin. And everything would work out for them. It absolutely would work out. The contract was signed a week later in the living room of the Old Willows. The rain that had poured all day finally stopped, and the smell of wet grass drifted in from the garden through the windows. A dog barked somewhere in the distance, and a fire crackled in the fireplace Silas had insisted on lighting it for coziness. Silas Blackwood sat in his favorite armchair. He was 70, but that evening he looked younger. A white shirt, a neatly trimmed beard, and a cup of tea with lemon in his hands. His cane stood nearby, but he was not leaning on it. On the contrary, he sat straight, like a man who is glad to have guests. "Make yourselves at home," he told Arthur and Mary. His voice was quiet, benevolent. "This house has seen a lot. Let it bring you joy now." Agnes sat silently nearby, in a dark dress, with her hair gathered up. She barely moved, but her gaze was attentive. She seemed to be memorizing every detail: how Mary fixed her hair, how Arthur wiped his glasses with a nervous motion. Eleanor poured the tea. Her gray suit fit perfectly. Her white smile was exactly the same as on the Haven Homes business card. She moved lightly, familiarly, like a hostess at her own party. "We made everything as simple as possible." Eleanor pushed the folder towards Arthur. "The term is 2 years. The option fee, right to purchase, is 20,000 euros. And a tiny footnote, almost blending with the paper, non-refundable fee. The monthly payment was 3,000 euros, 40% higher than the average rent in the county. But this overpayment definitely goes towards the house's value, right? Arthur swallowed nervously, holding his pen over the paper. Of course, Arthur. Eleanor reassuringly covered his hand with hers. Her hand was warm and soft, like a cat's paw hiding claws. Everything is absolutely transparent. You move in now, pay slightly more than standard rent, and in 2 years the house becomes yours. Banks are currently willing to give mortgages to those who already live in the house and pay on time. Arthur nodded. He looked at the garden outside the window, at the old willows that seemed especially green after the rain. For the first time in a long while, it seemed to him that everything might work out. Mary was leafing through the papers more slowly. She sensed a catch, she always did, but Silas spoke so softly, Eleanor smiled so confidently, and outside the window the sun began to break through the clouds, flooding the living room with warm light. And Mary thought, maybe I am looking for complications for nothing. People cannot be so calculated. The main thing here is to keep everything in order. Silas seemed to read her thoughts. Pay on time, take care of the house, don't take on extra loans. Then in 2 years the bank will see that you are reliable, and everything will come together. He said this with such sincerity that Arthur smiled back, and Mary signed quickly so as not to change her mind. Eleanor gathered the documents. She walked to the window and threw it open. Fresh air and the chiming of some distant bell tower rushed into the room. To the start of a new life, she said. Silas raised his cup. Agnes gave a barely noticeable nod. And outside, after the rain, a rainbow arched over the roof of the old willows. Beautiful, optimistic, as if everything really was starting well. Only Mary, already leaving the house, caught herself thinking that she had not remembered a single concrete promise. There were only words, simple, on time, reliable, and also the feeling that if something went wrong, she and Arthur would somehow turn out to be the guilty ones. But the sun shone so brightly that she brushed the thought aside. The O'Connor family moved into the house. For 2 months they lived as if in a fairy tale, until the frost hit in early January, and the old boiler let out a death rattle. The hot water disappeared, and living became uncomfortable. Neither bathe nor wash hands with warm water. Arthur immediately called Silas. He surprisingly cheerfully promised to send his repairman. The repairman indeed arrived, tinkered for 2 days, and issued an invoice for a substantial amount. When Arthur forwarded the bill to Silas, the reply came from the agency. According to your contract, all expenses are borne by the tenants. That same night, Mary sat down at the kitchen table, turned on the desk lamp, and armed herself with a magnifying glass. She found it on page 15. Clause 14b, and in fine print, all financial and technical responsibility for major repairs, wear and tear, and maintenance of utilities lies solely with the tenant. They had signed it on their own. They had to gut their credit card. But the real blow awaited them in the 8th month. Mary, preparing for the future mortgage, decided to visit an independent broker in advance. She brought him all the papers. The broker, a gloomy man in a crumpled jacket, ran the address through the land registry and frowned. Mrs. O'Connor, this house cannot be sold. Not to you, not to anyone else. What do you mean? Mary felt a chill crawl down her spine. There is a judicial attachment on the property, judgment mortgage. Huge unpaid debts of Mr. Blackwood to the bank. They had no right to offer it for purchase. It is a dead asset. Dublin is flooded with freezing rain. Mary needed 2 days to pull the records from the company's registration office. She found the legal address of the Haven Homes Agency, and then the home address of its director. In the prestigious Killiney area, just a half-hour drive away, on that rainy evening, the O'Connors stood on the porch of a luxurious mansion. The door swung open. Eleanor stood on the threshold, in a homemade cashmere cardigan, without makeup. Her signature porcelain smile instantly slid off, replaced by a mask of genuine fright. She reflexively tried to slam the door shut, but Arthur made a lightning-fast lunge, driving his massive umbrella cane with an iron tip straight into the doorway. The wood crunched plaintively. "Perhaps you will invite us in, Miss Vance?" Arthur asked in a firm, ringing voice, pushing the hostess aside with his shoulder. "Yes, of course," Eleanor babbled, stepping back. They walked into a spacious living room where a fire blazed hotly in the fireplace. Silas sat in a leather armchair without any cane, holding a glass of expensive whiskey. Curled up on the sofa was Agnes, enthusiastically flipping through a fashion magazine. Seeing the guests, the old couple froze. "Oh, and Mr. and Mrs. Blackwood are here too," Mary exclaimed. She walked up to the coffee table and slammed the wet folder down on it. "Clause 8.3 of our contract, Eleanor," Mary began. Her voice cut the air like a glass cutter. "The monthly overpayment of €1,000 is framed not as part of the house's value, but as a non-refundable consulting services fee for the agency." Eleanor was silent, nervously clutching the edges of her cardigan. "But that is not all." Mary pulled out a sheet with a crest seal from the top. "Eleanor Vance, maiden name Blackwood. You are Silas Blackwood's daughter. You are not an agent. You are an accomplice in a fraudulent group." A heavy silence hung in the room. The only sounds were the rain furiously lashing against the panoramic windows and the logs crackling in the fireplace. "Your scheme is brilliant in its simplicity." Mary began to pace the room slowly. "You find desperate people. You take a $20,000 non-refundable deposit from them. You milk them with inflated rent, force them to do repairs at their own expense. And when in 2 years the bank denies them a mortgage, and it will deny them, because your house has a judgment mortgage on it, you terminate the contract and keep everything. And then you look for new suckers for the role of the O'Connors." Agnes nervously set her magazine aside. Her lips twisted into an evil, not at all elderly sneer. Silas slowly stood up. Without the cane, he seemed much taller and tougher. "That is a very fascinating theory, Mrs. O'Connor, but you have not a single shred of proof of intent. We just wanted to sell the house and the judgment mortgage. Well, business affairs? It happens. Go to court. We shall see whose money for lawyers runs out faster." Mary stopped. She took her phone out of her pocket. "Under Irish law, Mr. Blackwood, I have every right to record any conversation in which I participate, without warning." She pressed the play button. Silas's cheerful voice from 8 months ago echoed through the room. "The bank will authorize everything, Arthur. We have perfect paperwork for the house. No encumbrances. I guarantee it. Do not worry." Intentional misrepresentation for financial gain. Mary hid the phone in her pocket. "Either you return every cent right now, or tomorrow morning this recording, the CRO statements, and a fraud report will land on the desk of detectives at the Garda National Economic Crime Bureau." Silas turned pale. He looked at his daughter. Eleanor closed her eyes and gave a barely noticeable nod. "The safe is in the study, Dad," she said hollowly. "Give it to them. Otherwise, they will drag us through the courts." 40 minutes later, Arthur and Mary walked out into the pouring rain. Arthur tightly clutched a heavy envelope to his chest, containing €20,000 in cash and a check for the overpaid amounts. In Mary's pocket lay a signed contract termination agreement with no mutual claims. The deadline to vacate the house was 2 weeks, regardless of how Eleanor tried to force them to leave immediately. 8 very difficult months passed. The O'Connors managed to buy a small, cozy house an hour's drive from Dublin, and Mary was drinking her morning tea, flipping through the Sunday Irish Examiner newspaper. On the real estate page, her eye caught the familiar silhouette of the ivy-covered mansion. Unique offer, rent to buy, no deposit. Below it was the name of a new agency, Green Horizon Estates, address Cork City, and a small photograph of the director. Looking back at Mary from the newspaper page was a charming lady in a flawless emerald suit, under a different name, and with the exact same unnaturally white, predatory smile.